They called it a catastrophic breach of protocol. What they really meant was my career was over. I can still feel the cold, dead weight of the moment my keycard was deactivated. The sterile silence of the lab, broken only by the hum of the climate control and the quiet, triumphant smirk on Dr. Finch's face. He'd done it. He'd switched my cordyceps cultures, replacing my life's work with a weaponized strain of aspergillus so aggressive it sent 3 lab techs to the ICU. And in the space of a single breath, I went from Dr. Thorne, promising mycologist, to a pariah, a monster, the man who couldn't be trusted with a petri dish. My life didn't just unravel. It was systematically dismantled, fired, blacklisted, humiliated. There was nowhere to go but home, and home was a place where failure was the only sin that couldn't be forgiven. I retreated to the garage, the smell of my father's motor oil and sawdust replacing the clean antiseptic scent of the lab. My family didn't see a man betrayed. They saw a disgrace. My father, a man of cold, hard pragmatism, would stare at my makeshift lab bench, a sheet of plywood over 2 sawhorses, and just shake his head. Still playing with your mushrooms, Eris? Hasn't that hobby cost you enough? My mother's concern was worse. It was a smothering pity. Her whispers to my aunt on the phone, painting me as a fragile mind shattered by ambition. He's not well, she'd say. He spends all day in that filthy garage, reading those old strange books. He talks about possession. They were right about the books. With my professional reputation in ashes, I turned to the fringe, the forbidden. I dove into the field they'd all warned me about in grad school, bio-occult mycology. The study of fungal strains whispered about in local folklore. Things tied to disappearances in the deep woods, to madness, to whispers on the wind. They called it pseudoscience, a dangerous obsession. To me, it was the only path left. I became fixated on a local legend, a species the old-timers called Whisper Spore, or Mycena silentium, a fungus that didn't just infect the body, but the mind. They said it fed on consciousness itself. In the garage, under the flickering fluorescent light, I finally managed to cultivate a sample of Mycena silentium from a sliver of bark I'd found deep in the cursed woods. It didn't look like much, a pale, almost translucent mycelial mat. But when I leaned close, I felt it, a low, static hum. Not in my ears, but directly in my skull. It started with echoes of my own thoughts, my own despair twisted back at me. Then it grew bolder. It showed me a flash of Finch's hand. Deftly swapping the labels on my cultures, it broadcast his smug internal monologue. The sabotage wasn't a theory anymore. It was a memory I hadn't made. For months, I teetered on the brink of insanity. The whispers from the fungus were constant, a psychic parasite siphoning my sanity. It showed me things, the last terrified thoughts of animals that had died near it, the deep, ancient coldness of the earth. The residual agony of a hiker who'd gotten lost in those woods a decade ago. I almost broke. I almost let it consume me, but in that abyss, something shifted. I stopped fighting the whispers and started listening. I learned their frequency. I learned to filter the noise, to focus, to direct the psychic resonance. I hadn't just survived it, I'd mastered it. I had turned a psychic predator into a sensory organ. The mockery of my peers, the shame of my family, it all burned away, leaving behind a cold, terrifying purpose. Years passed. The world forgot about Dr. Thorne, the disgraced researcher, but a new name began circulating in the hushed corridors of esoteric government agencies and private security firms. Thorne, the bio-occultist. The man who could track things that left no tracks. The man who could find people the world had given up for dead. I was no longer a disgrace. I was a grim necessity. The call I had always known would come finally did. It was my mother, her voice a shredded ruin of panic. My nephew, Leo, was gone. He'd been playing near the old woods, the same woods they'd always told me were perfectly safe. The police search had found nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing, nothing. I returned home not as the prodigal son, but as a specialist. I parked my nondescript black van in the driveway and saw my father on the porch. The years had stooped his shoulders, and the arrogance in his eyes was replaced by a desperate, hollow fear. "Eris," he choked out, "they can't find him." I didn't offer comfort. I just opened the back of the van, revealing my gear. It wasn't the high-tech equipment of a search party. It was a single, climate-controlled case. Inside, pulsing with a faint internal light, was my cultivated sample of Mycena silentium. What is that?" my mother whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "It's my hobby," I said, my voice flat. "I'm going to listen for him." My father's old skepticism flared for a second. "Listen with a mushroom?" "Eris, for God's sake, be serious." I didn't argue. I carried the case to the edge of the woods, the place where Leo was last seen. My parents followed, their fear warring with their ingrained disbelief. I placed the case on the ground and unsealed it. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and damp earth. A low hum vibrated through the soles of our shoes. "What's happening?" my mother cried. And then the whispers started. It wasn't a sound. It was a presence, an intrusion. I saw my mother's mind reel as a torrent, the fear of 1,000 smaller creatures, the slow, silent growth of the trees, and underneath it all, a vast, hungry, ancient consciousness. The wild fungus. Then, piercing through the cacophony, a single, terrified thought, small and sharp. Cold. So cold. "Mommy?" "Leo," I breathed. My parents stared at me, their faces masks of pure, unadulterated terror. The thing they had mocked, the madness they had ridiculed, was now speaking to them in the most intimate, violating way imaginable. They weren't just seeing the proof of my work. They were experiencing the horror of it firsthand. In my father's eyes, I saw the dawning, soul-crushing realization of what I had endured for years in that garage, what I had to become to survive. He wasn't looking at his failed son anymore. He was looking at something that had communed with the abyss and returned, bearing its mark. I closed my eyes, focusing past their panic, and followed the thin thread of my nephew's consciousness. I walked into the woods, leaving them shivering at the edge of a world they never knew existed. An hour later, I walked back out with Leo in my arms, cold and scared, but alive. My father tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. The apology, the gratitude, the horror, it was all there, tangled and useless. There was nothing to say. I had saved his grandson. But I had also shattered his reality. Vindicated, yes, but the triumph was as cold and silent as the mycelial network now spreading unseen beneath their feet. I had proven them wrong, and in doing so, I had shown them a truth so terrifying they would spend the rest of their lives wishing they could go back to the simple comfort of their disbelief. They had their son back. I just had the whispers, and I knew, as I drove away, that I could never truly come home again.